Well, welcome. I'm Ann Marshall with Archetype and Ancient Wisdom. And today we have the pleasure of being in the company of Bob Amason. And I really feel strongly, since we're talking about art, and I see that as with the capital letter A, that art refers to anything creative. And for a change of pace, I thought Bob would offer us a lot of conversation and insight around the fact that he is a writer. Now, I don't know how long Bob's been a writer, but I know he's been a U.S. Air Force officer. He's a retired university professor with a couple of decades under his belt. And he's published 4 historical novels, 2 mysteries, and 2 essays since 2022. That is very prolific. He has a new historical novel series on World War II in the works, and he's sold more than 4,500 copies of books since January of this year. That is very impressive, Bob. Is there something I've left out that you want to be sure to get included?
No, you hit it all. As we were mentioning before we started, I write under my pen name, Frank A. Mason. It's actually sort of a change up on my real name, and that's because my actual last name is so close to Amazon that I figured it would confuse everybody beyond all belief if I wrote under my actual name. So I use the pen name Frank A. Mason. And so sometimes people have a hard time finding my stuff, but it's almost exclusively on Amazon. And you're right. I have a young friend who's helped me create a series of Amazon ads, and they brought in quite a number of readers and made me very happy. You mentioned being prolific. As you know, my wife works full time still as a college professor, and so she works out of the house, and I would be in trouble if I kept going in saying, "Want to go get some lunch?" So I've had to have something to do. Plus, I discovered when I retired from being a college professor, I discovered that you can only play so much golf, and you can only goof around in the yard so much. And at some point you say, well, I don't want to be an intellectual desert. So I found myself thinking about the stuff that I had written or had thought up that I should write. And so I began pursuing that. So I got started on this as I thought it might be fun to see what I could do about writing a novel. I'd never written one. So I wrote this book. I don't know if it may be hard to see.
Mm-hmm. The Journeyman in the Bridge.
Yes, and this is my first book, and you can see I overdid it. Got to be pretty big. This has been my big bestseller, and I got started on this. As you can see, there's a guy in colonial garb and a couple of women who like him quite a bit, and there's a bunch of stuff going on. He's a young gunsmith in the 1770s, and the American Revolution is coming, and he keeps getting pulled in whether he likes it or not. Ironically, there are historical facts associated with that. Gunsmiths were typically not allowed to serve in the militia on the front line carrying a weapon. Rather, they were frequently brought in as contractors to repair the weapons and so forth for the rest of the militia. I stumbled into that because I didn't really want to make him a militia member, at least not at the beginning. And so he ends up getting contracts, and he's thinking, this is great because I'll get money and then I'll be able to move to the frontier and marry the woman I love and have a little farm and do gunsmithing for all the other pioneers on the frontier. In this case, that would have been in Western North Carolina, what's now Tennessee. So that was his goal, and he keeps getting pulled in whether he likes it or not. And so that spurred, go ahead.
So what was the actual spark? If you can kind of think back to that moment, it was like, oh, I have an idea for a book. Was
Yeah,
that a specific moment or time, or
it was, I keep getting, somehow, I do not know how I got a subscription, but I got a subscription to this online magazine, or it's a journal really, of the Journal of the American Revolution. And I kept getting interesting articles, and I would pull one and throw it in a pile. And I had ideas about maybe writing a historical novel series about St. Augustine, which is still on my list.
which is where you live?
Yes, and
Mhm.
since we live here in this huge cradle of history, I had that idea. Um, I have a number of other ideas for historical novels. For example, few people know that the rivalries between Georgia and Florida are not limited to football, but there were a good number of shooting wars between the two future states, and in fact, after the advent of the United States, shooting wars between Florida as a Spanish possession and Georgia as a U.S. state, and the rest of the United States involved. So all of those things have percolated, and I've amassed a pile of interesting research. And in fact, you contributed your big pile of research materials for everyone who's watching. Anne had a complete collection of El Escribando, which is the Historical Society, St. Augustine Historical Society journal, which they're now on my shelf. And someday I'm going to dig through those, and there'll be another series called La Florida. I haven't gotten there yet, but that's on the list. So the spark was seeing this thing about the American Revolution kept coming in, and one day I saw it said America 250, and I said, "What's that?" And I looked at it. Well, I had neglected to notice that in 2026 that will be our 250th anniversary. Since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So I said, well, maybe it's appropriate to talk about the American Revolution here. And so that's what sparked that idea. So.
Well, I'm also curious, since you have been so prolific, and I have a copy of this book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And now, if this is less than the other one, which it looks like it is, but it's still quite substantial, very curious as to how you structure your day, because you've created quite a volume in a short period of time. So do you have like certain hours of the day, or a number of words that you write, or is it, wait until the candle burns out? I mean, how do you actually make it happen? Because putting the rubber to the road is different than talking about it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. So my process for writing a novel starts with research. And I have a general idea of kind of what a character might do during a period of time. And I look to that period of time. I do research about that period of time. That's usually bounded by what I intend for the character to do, at least what I think the character will do, because these things will change. Just as with your art, I'm sure when you start working on it, you have a mental picture, and when you get finished, you go, well, it doesn't look exactly like what I intended, but it is what I intended because that's what came out, and that's the way it worked. As to so I do all the research, and I find that the research also leads to tendrils that go in different directions. At one point, I'm sort of thinking this, and I find this. And a perfect example is my latest series that has not been published yet. I've finished the first book. It's called Sunlit Silence, and it's about World War II in the air. And I happen to know a good bit about that just from years of being interested in reading about airplanes, and particularly that era. I thought that it would be about four young guys who move through the system of going to Canada to learn how to fly, and going and getting into the RAF and flying for the RAF. That was the framework, but as I started working on it, I realized that I had to stay with one character and let the others be supporting cast. And then I realized that the book I intended to write at the beginning was actually two books. So instead of a book this thick, it's going to be two books this thick. There's some value in that too, in that if I sold a book this thick for what I typically can sell a Kindle book for, I'd be leaving a lot of money on the table, because at a certain point that you can't really ask for more money than what they might sell for. So I learned a number of things with the first series of books, that while I wrote 3 books in that series, they were all about 120,000 words apiece, and they needed to be more like about 80 or 85. So I wrote 6 books instead of 3, even though they're 3 official books. So to answer the rest of your question about the day, Derry usually heads into her office about 9, and I sit down with my laptop and look at my synopsis that I've pre-built, research, synopsis, and start trying to write. And I find that I'll start writing a chapter and I'll think I know where it's going to go. And by the time I get finished with the chapter, I have to go back and change the chapter title because it's moved in a different direction. I mean, it's the same general direction, but it's moved in a, I wouldn't say surprising direction, just toward a little bit of an alternate approach.
Maybe synchronicity.
Yeah, and as things move along, I keep finding these historical coincidences that I didn't expect. And so I'll have my character cruising right along, and then there'll be some historical coincidence that I come up with, and magically, things will turn hard left or hard right or whatever, and go for a distance, and then come back to the theme. Yeah. We usually break for lunch, and then she'll go back to work, and then I'll work for another couple hours. And some days I go drink coffee with my buddies. And the whole time I'm sitting there with my buddies, stuff's percolating in my brain about what should I be doing next. And I'm sure you have the same thing. You're like, I really should be working on this because I have really great ideas, but you can't become a hermit.
Yeah, well, speaking of hermit, which is a wonderful archetype, are you aware of at all incorporating specific archetype characters into your stories, like hero, warrior, king of the roost, I don't know, damsel, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, perhaps not in exactly those terms. I suspect you're familiar with the work of Joseph Campbell. For those who are tuning in, I'll give you the brief thumbnail. Joseph Campbell came up with the idea that every story is essentially the same story with just a different name for the essentially same hero. And there's a cyclical storyline for highly successful stories. Perfect example is Star Wars, where it's a hero quest. And so I had in mind the idea of a hero quest. And so some of the things that writers do, which I'm sure is similar to visual arts, is you'd like to avoid cliches. You'd like to avoid boring the reader, but you do have sort of an expected sequence of events. Like there's always the reluctant hero, and in fact, in this book, Blue Green for the Grave, the hero is just a regular guy in St. Augustine who's kind of a goof off, never been really terribly successful, and he finds himself getting pulled into a search for his college roommate who has disappeared. And two very bad people have apparently moved in with the roommate, or the former roommate back from back when, and absconded, sold his house for him, absconded with all of his money, and disappeared with him and a brand new catamaran, power catamaran, to the Virgin Islands. And so our hero goes on a quest. He goes on a quest to go find the lost college roommate. Things don't turn out too good for a whole lot of people in that book, as you can imagine. And there's some really terrible people. I must have needed a catharsis to get rid of bad people in my life or something. But yeah, so there is this archetypal Campbell hero myth. His book, for those who might be interested, is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and then he's written a couple of other books that have this sort of this cyclical. And you start off as a reluctant hero, and you go on your quest, and you meet dragons and damsels and helpers and enemies, and sometimes they're shapeshifters who start off as enemies and become friends, and ultimately then you descend into hell. There's always the descent into hell, where you it's sort of like the Minoan labyrinth, where you meet the Minotaur, and you're victorious over the Minotaur, and then you climb to the surface with the golden fleece, and you hold it up to everybody, and everybody goes yay, and then you go back to your normal life. That's sort of that archetypal cycle. And so if you want to be successful as a writer of anything that has any kind of a mystery, any kind of a life story of someone, and the first three books are the life story of a young man named Will Yelverton. There's a fourth book coming that I'm going to write here in the fall. That will be my my entertainment for the fall. You want to cover the thing and make it like he's in a quest of some kind. So in the first book, his quest is trying to just go to Philadelphia to collect some gun parts. Surprisingly, most gunsmiths did not make all their own parts. So he goes to Philadelphia to try to buy the parts. Well, guess what? The British have already embargoed all that. He gets there, he finds out that he's kind of out of luck, and things happen. I would tell you what happens, but then you wouldn't read the book. And ultimately, he finds himself in Georgia in this book, this second book. This book is a finalist for the Royal Palm Literary Award in the state of Florida this year. This is called Heart of Tempered Steel, and it's his adventures in Georgia during in part of the Revolution that few people know about, and so. I think that you've mentioned things like archetypes. If I'm talking about me, I'm more of a storyteller with a bit of a historical bent, because I really like history, but I've always been a storyteller. And all the years that I was a teacher, I found that storytelling is the way to convey ideas, even if they're abstract. You tell a story and you can convey an idea. And I've been a teacher of adults since 1980. When I was in the military, became a college professor in 1997 as I was exiting the military, and I found that I've always been a storyteller. So if there was anything that is like first on the list, it would be storyteller. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I can see like historian is kind of um, scribing or educating the facts, but a storyteller has a beginning and a middle and an end.
Yes.
And storyteller to me, has this cosmic lesson or cosmic wisdom attached to it in the lightest of that archetype. In the shadow, to me, storyteller is not knowing when to end, losing the point of the story, sometimes shifting the facts to try to make a particular outcome that is not necessarily representative in the light. I think a storyteller can leave room for various interpretations as well. So do you have any sense that you were a storyteller as a young kid?
Yeah. I think I learned storytelling from my father, who was he was a great teller of jokes. He could tell a joke and have you howling before you got to the punchline. My mom was a storyteller. She would tell you all about things with her family and so forth. Of course, I paid this much attention. So now when I start to try to look back at the genealogy of my families, I go, now which one was Aunt, whatever her name is, and she's long ago lost, and both my parents have passed on. So I'm afraid I don't have the source to go back and ask, right? But yeah, I had never really contemplated much about this until some recently, I guess. I was not aware that I guess I'm a creative. I had no idea that I'm one of those people that they call creatives. That they did. When I was 13, I managed to get $35 together and bought me a Sears Silvertone guitar because I wanted to learn how to play guitar. A bunch of my friends thought I was a moron. You can spend that on a lot of other stuff. Yeah, but I enjoyed playing other people's music, and I also enjoyed just sort of messing with the guitar, for just to see what I could make it sound like. So I think singer-songwriters are kind of storytellers as well. I wrote a few really terrible songs that I would not share with anybody because they're really bad. But it's when you discover that you have something of a creative gene, and I guess I must have gotten that. My mom was not very good at drawing or anything like that. She had her own creative side, but my dad was very artistic, even though he would have never applied himself to art in the form of paint and canvas or doing the kind of things that you do. I recall one time I needed a sword for Boy Scout, Cub Scouts. We were all going to dress up like knights, and I was just going to go get a stick, and my dad took a piece of wood and he cut it and painted it and put a handle on it, and he made that thing look really great. And of course it fell apart right away. It broke in half right away. But I recall that as being one of his sort of a creative contribution. So I think I've been a storyteller. I tried writing a couple of times when I was much younger, but that was a failure because I didn't really have the tools necessary. I discovered that when you have a facility to use a computer, it makes it a heck of a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how anybody writes a novel, how do you write that thick with
Longhand.
pen and paper longhand? I don't,
Right.
so I don't know if
So,
I answered your question, but yeah.
so how do you how do you nourish your creative storyteller self? What do you deliberately do to keep reigniting that spark for you and bringing that to life?
Well, and I've said this to a lot of people over all the years is I read a lot. One of my friends commented that you can't write a great sentence unless you've read a great sentence. So it's important to me to read. Since I've been writing, I haven't had the opportunity to read as much as I would have preferred to. And I mean, I used to keep a book going all the time, but perhaps in the middle of writing a story, I'll read a book that's related to the story I'm writing, and find ways to incorporate the flow and feel of that book into what I'm doing. I was a military aviator. I understand flying airplanes, but in my latest book, the hero is a pilot. And in the course of writing that book, I read a contemporaneous book written in 1941 about this guy's experiences in France flying during the Battle of France. He was an RAF officer, and I was able to get the sense of what it felt like because everybody was getting bombed. They were trying to fly their airplanes off of grass landing strips that had big holes in them from bombs that are, what it felt like to encounter the enemy in those early days. And so I was able to use some of the sense of that. And the fun thing that happened was I realized that the guy that wrote the book, he would be a good character to bring in. So I brought him in as a side character.
Oh, interesting.
And he does this. And like I mentioned, the strange coincidences. My character ultimately will end up with the RAF. He's met this guy in France. He will ultimately end up in the RAF, and he'll end up, because this is where Americans went, with British number 609 Squadron at a station called Middle Wallop. The Brits had great names for things, right? And at the same time, I was looking at the career of the author of the book called Fighter Pilot, this guy named Paul Ritchie. He ended up at Middle Wallop at the same time. I had no idea that's where but the two of them end up together. And it just so happens that I connected my character to 3 other Americans who all get sent to 609 Squadron at Middle Wallop. So my character is going to go right along with them. And then Paul Ritchie, as it turns out, is a senior controller by this time. He's recovering from a wound. So he's grounded. And long before I found out all of that, I had invented a female love interest for my character, who is a female controller in the control building at Middle Wallop. So you have these weird coincidences where you're just going along and things are like this, and all of a sudden they do that. And you say, well, I could not have planned that. Maybe there's a cosmic force going, make it this way. So,
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of similar paths in terms of like visual arts. It's like there's a lot of research that's often done with visual arts. You know,
mhm,
your synopsis is similar to how a visual artist might sketch things. You know,
mhm.
and then there's the going with the flow, responding to the synchronicity, those happy accidents. You know, being able to take the detours as they present themselves. It's really kind of interesting to hear the parallels.
Yes.
But I want to ask you, for those of us who do have a story in us, what would you suggest would be next steps for someone who's interested in writing out their story and maybe going public or publishing it?
So those are several questions, different ones. To write the story, first thing is I get a huge piece of paper, one of these things where you put charts on and flip the chart. I just tear off one of those and I throw it down on the table, and I take a pencil, not a pen, because pencils can be erased. Pens, on the other hand, are kind of, you're stuck with it. And for a historical novel, I run out a timeline, and starting day whatever, ending with whatever. In the case of war novels, it's the beginning of the war usually, or the precursor of the things that were going on, the war itself, and then the end of the war, like that. Maybe if you're writing a historical novel, you are somewhat stuck with the actual march of events, which is okay, right? Because then you have a structure. You don't have to sit there and think, I wonder what I'll do next. And so I sketch all that out, and maybe I'll pick a section of the piece of paper and I'll just jot down, character sketches, and I'll write some of the characters' names down, and, bullet points under each one of them, born 1923 or something like that, age 20, whatever, dark hair, and so forth, just kind of a general character sketch, not a complete one, and then you get all that, and then you start saying, okay, where will these characters interface with each other with these events? And once you've done that, once I've done all that, then I sit down and I basically go, chapter 1. I have written in the past, I have written the last chapter first. I have written in the middle of the book first, because that was an exciting piece and I wanted to be sure to have that. And then I had to go back and say, okay, how will what will be the antecedents of this? How will I pull that together? And as you mentioned, and we've already talked about here, you're working away. And as I'm sure you go, I did not know I had this gold thread. I forgot I had this gold thread, and this is going in this. And it's the same thing. It's like, I forgot that I had this. Oh, look, it's on my big piece of paper. And so when you write it, you have to finish it, just like your art. You can't walk in the room every day and go, well, there it is. It's still waiting on me. So you have to finish it. And sometimes you have to remember you have a family, the other night, Derry goes, I'm really enjoying being ignored here. And I said, I have to finish this last chapter, because when I hit finish, then I can publish this, And she's like, I understand. And then I got so when it comes to publishing, you can do it yourself. And you can go to Amazon and you can get yourself a thing called a Kindle Direct Publishing account. They're free, fairly easy to do. The big problem is knowing all the rules and the little secrets and the how-tos. So what I've done is I found a company that's they're loosely associated with Amazon, and I go to them and I say, okay, here's my latest book. Here's some ideas about the cover. They have some graphic designers who are very good. And the covers, sometimes these guys are not in the United States and they're not native English speakers. Or if they are, they speak a different variety of English. They don't have the same experience that we do. This book started out with these two women flanking a guy with a big lantern jaw, carrying a musket and wearing a Continental Army outfit. And I said, no, my character is a frontiersman. As you can see, he's not wearing a uniform here. I had to show him what this outfit would have looked. This is a hunter's shirt and so forth from that period. I had to show them that. I had to say, no, he has to look like this. I want him on a horse, and he has two women that are interested in him, and he's interested in them. But you can't just make it like they're adoring. This is not one of those, as they say, bodice rippers, where it's all about their romance. It's really about him, and these are the two women who are woven into his life. So once I told them that, boom, they nailed it. This one was another interesting thing. I told the guys, I said, this book involves one of the ultimate scenes is in a spring in Florida, and it involves a power catamaran. So the first try at the cover was a snowy landscape with a beat up New England lobster boat. And I said, what part of lobster boat fits into this idea? I redid this idea for him. Finally, I sent him this picture of a spring. This is a Florida spring, couldn't tell you which one. And a picture of a catamaran. Bang, they got it. They figured that right out. Who knows? But I told him, don't throw away the lobster boat and the snowy background, because I might write something about that one day. So.
Well, speaking of that, as our time starts to dwindle down here, what is next for you?
Next is I'm going to finish I just finished book 1 of the Sunlit Silence series. The second book will be entitled, the first one's entitled Sunward I've Climbed. The second book will be called The Shouting Wind, and it will be a continuation. Then I will return to these guys and write the fourth book in this series, the Revolutionary War series, will be about essentially the events leading up to Yorktown and the Battle of Yorktown. There's 2 more in that series that I will do, but that's probably take me to the end of the year. Next year, starting in January, I think I'm going to start working on the La Florida series and start trying to do some things with that. There is a character in this book, and I neglected to mention this. I wrote this. A lot of guys look at this and go, I'm not too terribly excited about reading about 4 women in the Revolution. They should be. The women of the Revolution were left at home, while in the case of many of them, their husbands were out gallivanting around, riding horses and shooting at bad guys and eating by the campfire and, spitting in the fire and telling tall tales to each other. And the women were home, either managing a plantation or dealing with, as in the case of one of the characters in this book, a woman named Peggy. She's got 3 kids and her in the middle of nowhere in Wilkes County, Georgia, trying to live, trying to keep the farm going. Husband's gone. One of the characters, this young Black woman here, she, throughout this entire book, wants to escape, and I won't tell you whether she does or not, but she'll feature in La Florida.
Cool.
Well, I've already got a character made, and she was really a good character, and so she'll be in La Florida. Perhaps the other, at least 2 of the others will. You never know, because, like I say, I'll start, and then one day I'll look up and say, "Gosh, look at that." I'm having a good time doing this, if I wasn't having a good time, I would probably stop because it's a lot of work. It's like your art, sometimes you're bone tired and you're saying, I really, 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 really want to finish this work or whatever, and um, so once I get finished, I'm energized then because, I got that one done, the next one is calling my name. So what will happen over the next few years, assuming that I'm on this side of the grass long enough, I'm going to do the La Florida series. I have discovered through genealogical research that I'm a 7th generation Floridian. And some of those people had some interesting things, like one of my mother's family going way back actually owned the dead center of what is now Jacksonville. And
Wow.
he sold 18 acres of his 200-acre holding to Isaiah D. Hart, who founded Jacksonville on that spot. And I keep saying, if you'd have held on to it, I'd be smoking a cigarette on my cigar on my back porch and not caring,
Well, that'll
But
be,
so that's probably La Florida will be the next series that I do.
well, that'll be something to really look forward to. And I saved my favorite question for last, and that is, especially since you, as storyteller, we know passing on wisdom. And with that in mind, what do you want the world to know?
Well, there's a lot of things I want the world to know. I want everybody to, if anybody's interested in writing, I want you to know that some people find it incredibly difficult. Some people find it just flows out of them onto a page. Finding out how to publish is always a kind of a surprise. I was fortunate in that I have a friend who lives in England. He's written 180 books in the last 10 years. He makes me look like a piker. His name is Griff Hosker. He writes historical novels, typically set in the kind of in the Dark Ages, medieval time in England. I've often joked that when I grow up, I'd like to be Griff Hosker, but he's helped me understand the business of this, which if you're going to do it, you also end up kind of having to be a business person. The late Jimmy Buffett, just 2 days ago, passed 3 days ago. He made the comment that you can be a great musician all you want to be, but at some point you have to be a businessman. Whether you like it or not, you're going to end up being a businessman. Well, when he passed, he was worth $1 billion. So I guess he was right. And I never set out to sell books. But I'm fortunate that my friend John Green has helped me set up ads. And I don't think I'm going to become rich, but I think that the goal is to have people read my writing. And so it's exciting that I've had sales. Apparently somebody likes what I write. What else do I want the world to know? If you want to spin a story, read Joseph Campbell, and then you'll at least know what the beginning, the middle, and the end is supposed to look like within the confines of our culture, that people always expect a resolution of something, that people want a resolution of a story. They don't want it to just sort of just trail off. So that's something I try to do with every book, is I try for that book, even though it's part of a series, I try for it to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and tell the story and be done with that story, so that when it says the end at the very last of it, it really is the end of that story, but it's not the end of the grand sweep of history or whatever you want to say that particular character inhabits.
Wow. There was a lot of information in our time together, and I just want to let people know that you can follow Bob in the information attached, and the Amazon links as well. And I want to wish you good luck with that Florida Literary Award for the Heart of Tempered Steel.
Thanks.
Keeping my fingers crossed for you.
Yeah, I hope
And
so.
and thank you very much, Bob. Our time together was very special. Thank
Well,
you.
thanks. And having known you for these many years, it's always a pleasure to see you again. And you'll have to come look at our latest addition to the house, our kitchen, for which I hope someday to pay. So
With your books, with the book
That's-
sales.
hopefully, yeah. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Bob.